Abraham Lincoln, born on February 12, 1809, near Hodgenville, Kentucky, was one of the most transformative figures in American history. As the 16th President of the United States, serving from 1861 to 1865, he led the nation through its most challenging and turbulent period, the American Civil War. With unwavering resolve and a deep sense of moral purpose, Lincoln dedicated himself to preserving the Union and guiding the country through a time of immense division and bloodshed. His leadership not only kept the United States united, but also marked a turning point in the fight for human freedom. Through his efforts, he brought about the emancipation of enslaved people in the United States, changing the course of history and laying the foundation for a more just and equal nation. Lincoln's legacy continues to inspire generations, reminding us of the power of courage, vision, and integrity in the face of overwhelming adversity. Among American heroes, Abraham Lincoln continues to have a unique and lasting appeal not only for his fellow compatriots, but also for people around the world. This powerful charm comes from his extraordinary life story, a journey that began in the humblest of circumstances and led to a dramatic and historic legacy. It also springs from his deeply human and compassionate personality, qualities that resonate across generations. Lincoln holds a monumental place in history as both the savior of the Union and the emancipator of enslaved people. His relevance not only endures but grows stronger with time, especially because of his powerful voice as a champion for democracy. To Lincoln, the Union was not just a political entity worth preserving for its own sake, but a living symbol of a greater ideal, the ideal of self-government. In recent years, scholars have delved more deeply into the political side of his character, especially his views on race, uncovering layers that continue to make him a compelling figure for study and reflection. A testament to his enduring legacy stands tall in the nation's capital, the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., which was dedicated to him on May 30, 1922. Lincoln was born in a simple backwoods cabin just 3 miles south of Hodgenville, Kentucky, and when he was only 2 years old, his family moved to a farm in the nearby valley of Knob Creek. His earliest memories came from this rugged home, and one that stood out vividly was the time a flash flood swept away the corn and pumpkin seeds he had helped his father plant. His father, Thomas Lincoln, came from a lineage that traced back to a weaver's apprentice who had journeyed from England to Massachusetts in 1637. Although not as well off as some of his Lincoln ancestors, Thomas was a resilient and hard-working pioneer. On June 12, 1806, he married Nancy Hanks. Tracing the Hanks family history has proven difficult, and Nancy is believed to have been born out of wedlock. She has often been described as stoop-shouldered, thin-breasted, sorrowful in expression, and deeply religious. Together, Thomas and Nancy Lincoln had 3 children, Sarah, Abraham, and Thomas, the youngest of whom tragically died in infancy. In December 1816, with a lawsuit threatening the ownership of his Kentucky farm, Thomas Lincoln packed up his family and moved to southwestern Indiana. There, with no formal claim to land, he became a squatter and quickly threw together a rough shelter known as a half-faced camp, a basic structure made of logs and branches, with one side completely open to the elements. The family huddled around a roaring fire for warmth and protection. Before long, Thomas built a permanent log cabin and later secured legal ownership of the land. Young Abraham pitched in, helping to clear the fields and tend to the crops, though he quickly developed a dislike for hunting and fishing. In later years, he remembered the wildness of Indiana vividly, the scream of panthers in the night, the bears that attacked their pigs, and the relentless hardship of life on the frontier, which he described as pretty pinching at times. The darkest chapter of his boyhood came with the death of his mother in the fall of 1818. Just 9 years old, dressed in rags, he watched her buried in the forest and endured a long winter without a mother's love. But fortune turned before the next winter arrived when Thomas Lincoln married Sarah Bush Johnston, a widow from Kentucky with 3 children of her own. She brought warmth, energy, and kindness into the home, treating all the children equally and creating a new sense of stability. She grew especially close to Abraham, who in turn came to adore her. In his later years, he would call her his angel mother. His stepmother certainly played a role in encouraging Lincoln's growing love for reading, but the true origin of his deep desire to learn remained something of a mystery. Both of his parents were nearly illiterate, and Abraham himself had only the most limited access to formal education. He once described his schooling as going school by littles, a little now and a little then, and all told, he had no more than a single year of actual classroom attendance. Still, that did not stop him. Neighbors remembered how he would walk miles just to borrow a book. Yet, in Lincoln's own words, his early environment offered absolutely nothing to excite ambition for education. He admitted that when he came of age, he did not know much. Still, somehow, he could read, write, and solve basic math problems up to the rule of 3, and that was the extent of his formal knowledge. What he lacked in quantity of books, he made up for in depth of understanding. The few books he read left a lasting impression. Among them were Parson Weems's life and memorable actions of George Washington, with its famous tale of the hatchet and the cherry tree, Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, and the timeless Aesop's fables. From a very young age, he also had some familiarity with the Bible, which was almost certainly the only book his family owned, shaping his language, values, and moral compass from the beginning. In March 1830, the Lincoln family set out on another migration, this time heading to Illinois, with young Abraham taking the lead by driving the team of oxen. He had just turned 21 and was standing at the threshold of his own independent life. Towering at 6 feet 4 inches, Lincoln was raw-boned and lanky, yet impressively muscular and strong. He was especially known for his skill and strength with an axe, a tool he had mastered through years of hard frontier labor. His voice carried a distinct backwoods twang, and his gait reflected the life he had known, long strides, flat-footed, and deliberate, like that of a seasoned plowman. Lincoln was good-natured, although he carried a certain moodiness. He had a natural gift for mimicry and storytelling, traits that quickly drew people to him and helped him make friends with ease. Still, at this stage of his life, whatever other talents he had were yet to be revealed to the world. After arriving in Illinois and realizing he had no interest in becoming a farmer, Lincoln explored a wide range of occupations. He started off as a rail splitter, helping to clear land and build fences on his father's new farm. Then he worked as a flatboatman, making a journey down the Mississippi River all the way to New Orleans, Louisiana. This trip was actually his second time visiting the city, the first having taken place back in 1828 when he was still living in Indiana. Once back in Illinois, Lincoln settled in the small village of New Salem, which had about 25 families and was located along the Sangamon River. There, he picked up various jobs including storekeeper, postmaster, and surveyor. When the Black Hawk War broke out in 1832, Lincoln enlisted as a volunteer and was elected captain of his company. Although he later joked that he never saw any live fighting Indians during the conflict, he claimed he did have a good many bloody struggles with the mosquitoes. All the while, Lincoln's ambition was growing. He aimed to become a legislator and, despite losing his first campaign, he was later elected multiple times to the state assembly. At one point he even considered becoming a blacksmith, but ultimately chose to pursue a career in law. Having already taught himself grammar and mathematics, he dove into law books and began studying. By 1836, after passing the bar examination, Abraham Lincoln officially began his practice as a lawyer. The following year, Lincoln made a major move to Springfield, Illinois, the new state capital, which presented far greater opportunities for an ambitious lawyer than the small village of New Salem ever could. In Springfield, Lincoln began to build his legal career, first partnering with John T. Stewart, then with Stephen T. Logan, and finally, in 1844, forming a lasting partnership with William H. Herndon. Herndon was nearly 10 years younger than Lincoln, more widely read, more emotionally charged in the courtroom, and typically more radical in his views. Despite these differences, their partnership proved to be almost ideal, one of those rare human arrangements that worked with surprising harmony. They kept very few formal records of their legal work and followed a simple system when it came to money. Whenever either of them was paid, they split the cash evenly. There were no reports of financial disputes between them, a rare and telling sign of mutual respect and trust. Within just a few years of settling in Springfield, Abraham Lincoln was earning between $1,200 and $1,500 a year, a respectable income considering that the governor of Illinois made 1,200 and circuit judges only 750. But Lincoln worked hard to earn every dollar. In order to stay busy and keep his practice going strong, he not only handled cases in the capital, but also followed the traveling court across the state. Every spring and fall, he would mount a horse or climb into a buggy and travel hundreds of miles across the sparsely populated prairie, visiting one tiny county seat after another. Most of the cases were minor, and the fees were small, but Lincoln's dedication never wavered. The arrival of the railroads, especially after 1850, made travel easier and the practice of law more profitable. Lincoln became a lobbyist for the Illinois Central Railroad, helping the company secure a charter from the state. He was then hired as a regular attorney for the railroad and successfully defended it when McLean County tried to tax its property. For that victory, he was awarded the largest fee of his legal career, $5,000, though he had to sue the company just to collect it. His growing reputation brought him work from other railroads, banks, insurance companies, and manufacturing and mercantile firms. In one of his most brilliant legal moments, he defended the Rock Island Bridge, the first bridge to span the Mississippi River, against powerful river transportation interests that wanted it removed. His caseload also included patent disputes and criminal trials. In one of his most famous courtroom victories, Lincoln defended a man named Duff Armstrong, an old friend's son, who was accused of murder. A key witness claimed to have seen the crime by moonlight, but Lincoln pulled out an almanac and showed that the moon was too low in the sky for anyone to see clearly. With a heartfelt and powerful appeal, Lincoln convinced the jury and won an acquittal, leaving an indelible mark as a lawyer who combined sharp intellect with deep compassion. By the time Abraham Lincoln began gaining national attention in politics, nearly 20 years after launching his legal career, he had firmly established himself as one of the most successful and respected lawyers in Illinois. Known for his sharp intelligence and down-to-earth common sense, Lincoln had an uncanny ability to see straight to the core of any legal issue. But it was not just his intellect that made him stand out. He was also admired for his consistent fairness and unwavering honesty, qualities that earned him deep respect from colleagues and clients alike. During his early days in New Salem, Lincoln became acquainted with Anne Rutledge. He was apparently very fond of her, and when she died at the young age of 22 in 1835, he mourned with the rest of the tight-knit community. In the years that followed, tales of a great romance between Lincoln and Rutledge began to circulate, but there is no solid historical evidence to back them up. A year after Anne's passing, Lincoln engaged in a lukewarm courtship with Mary Owens. Despite his efforts, Owens ultimately felt that Lincoln lacked the small but important qualities that bring a woman lasting happiness and declined his marriage proposal. As far as history can reliably tell us, the one true love of Lincoln's life was Mary Todd. She was spirited, intelligent, and well-educated, and she came from a notable Kentucky family. In Springfield, her relatives were part of the town's social elite, and not all of them approved of her connection with Lincoln. Even Lincoln himself sometimes questioned whether he could truly make her happy. Despite these doubts, the couple became engaged. But on what Lincoln would later call the fatal 1st of January in 1841, the engagement was broken off, seemingly at Lincoln's own request. The emotional fallout was devastating. Lincoln sank into a deep depression and battled overwhelming sadness for months. Eventually, though, the two reconciled. On November 4, 1842, Abraham Lincoln and Mary Todd were married, beginning a complex but enduring partnership that would carry them through some of the most turbulent years in American history. Abraham and Mary Lincoln had 4 children, all boys, but their family faced much heartache. Edward Baker, their second son, passed away at just 4 years old, and William Wallace, known as Willie, died at 11. The eldest, Robert Todd, was the only one of their children to survive into adulthood. However, their youngest, Thomas, or Tad, who had a cleft palate and a lisp, outlived his father. While Lincoln was deeply involved in the lives of his children, the task of raising them mostly fell to Mary. She was a mother who balanced strictness and leniency, and their home life was a mixture of affection, mutual support, and the occasional domestic disagreement, much like any married couple. But for Mary, life wasn't without struggle. She faced recurring headaches, temper issues, and a profound sense of insecurity and loneliness, worsened by her husband's long absences when he was away on the lawyer circuit. When Lincoln became president, things got even harder for Mary. The death of their son Willie was a devastating blow, and the pressures of the Civil War only added to her stress. Not to mention, the public's harsh criticisms of her role as First Lady didn't help. Over time, she developed a compulsive need to spend money, running up large bills, and even experienced moments of jealousy and emotional turmoil. By 1875, after all these trials, Mary was declared insane. Her mental health had deteriorated further after witnessing her husband's assassination. Despite all the turmoil, Mary had been a key influence on Abraham, supporting his ambition during their early years together and helping to shape his patience and tolerance in the face of immense hardship. Early in life, Lincoln had been something of a skeptic and freethinker. His reputation had been such that, as he once complained, the church influence was used against him in politics. When running for Congress in 1846, he issued a handbill to deny that he ever had spoken with intentional disrespect of religion. He went on to explain that he had believed in the doctrine of necessity, that is, that the human mind is impelled to action, or held in rest by some power over which the mind itself has no control. Throughout his life, he also believed in dreams and other enigmatic signs and portents. As he grew older, and especially after he became president and faced the soul-troubling responsibilities of the Civil War, he developed a profound religious sense, and he increasingly personified necessity as God. He came to look upon himself quite humbly as an instrument of providence, and to view all history as God's enterprise. In the present Civil War, he wrote in 1862, "It is quite possible that God's purpose is something different from the purpose of either party, and yet the human instrumentalities, working just as they do, are of the best adaptation to effect his purpose." Lincoln was fond of the Bible and knew it well. He also was fond of Shakespeare. In private conversation, he used many Shakespearean allusions, discussed problems of dramatic interpretation with considerable insight, and recited long passages from memory with rare feeling and understanding. He liked the works of John Stuart Mill, particularly on liberty, but disliked heavy or metaphysical works. Though he enjoyed the poems of Lord Byron and Robert Burns, his favorite piece of verse was the work of an obscure Scottish poet, William Knox. Lincoln often quoted Knox's lines beginning, "Oh, why should the spirit of mortal be proud?" He liked to relax with the comic writings of Petroleum V. Nasby, Orpheus C. Kerr, and Artemus Ward, or with a visit to the popular theater. When Abraham Lincoln first stepped into politics, Andrew Jackson was president, and although Lincoln shared Jackson's sympathy for the common man, he didn't quite agree with Jackson's belief that the government should stay out of economic matters. Lincoln felt that the legitimate purpose of government was to do for people what they couldn't do themselves, like helping a community achieve things that individuals couldn't on their own. He admired politicians like Henry Clay and Daniel Webster, who advocated for using the federal government's power to support business and national development. They pushed for things like a national bank, a protective tariff, and internal improvements to boost transportation. Lincoln, seeing the needs of Illinois and the western states, supported these ideas and aligned himself with the Whig Party, the party of Clay and Webster. As a member of the Illinois state legislature from 1834 to 1840, Lincoln threw himself into a huge project to build a system of railroads, highways, and canals using state funds. Though Whigs and Democrats worked together to pass the bill for these improvements, the Panic of 1837 and the resulting business depression caused most of the projects to be abandoned. During his time in the legislature, Lincoln made it clear that while he opposed slavery, he was not an abolitionist. In 1837, following the mob killing of Elijah Lovejoy, an anti-slavery newspaperman, the legislature introduced resolutions that defended slavery in the southern states as a sacred right under the Constitution and condemned abolitionist societies. Lincoln refused to vote for these resolutions. Instead, he and a colleague drafted a protest that acknowledged slavery was founded on both injustice and bad policy, but also warned that spreading abolitionist ideas could actually worsen the problem. During his one term in Congress from 1847 to 1849, Abraham Lincoln, the lone Whig from Illinois, didn't focus much on legislative matters. He did propose a bill for the gradual and compensated emancipation of enslaved people in the District of Columbia, but the bill was a tough sell. It would only take effect if approved by the free white citizens of the district, which angered both abolitionists and slaveholders, so it didn't get anywhere. Instead, Lincoln spent much of his time on presidential politics, hoping to unseat the Democrat President James K. Polk and replace him with a Whig. The issue that got his attention was the Mexican War. Lincoln challenged Polk's claim that Mexico started the war by shedding American blood on American soil with his famous spot resolutions. Along with his fellow Whigs, he voted to condemn Polk and the war, but still voted to provide supplies to continue it. At the same time, Lincoln worked hard to support the candidacy of war hero Zachary Taylor, hoping that Taylor's victory would land him a government job. But after Taylor won, Lincoln was disappointed when he wasn't given the position he expected, Commissioner of the General Land Office. At 40, frustrated and feeling sidelined in politics, Lincoln stepped away from public life for about 5 years. However, in 1854, a new political crisis brought him back. His political rival, Stephen A. Douglas, introduced the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which reopened the Louisiana purchase to slavery and gave settlers in Kansas and Nebraska the power to decide for themselves whether to allow slavery. This move sparked violent opposition in Illinois and the wider Northwest, and it ultimately led to the rise of the Republican Party, while the Whig Party began to crumble. Lincoln, now among many former Whigs, joined the Republican Party in 1856. Soon after, some in the party hoped to convince Douglas to switch sides and bring his followers with him. But Lincoln had other plans. He was determined to become the Republican leader in Illinois and not let Douglas take that position. In 1858, Abraham Lincoln took on the powerful incumbent Senator Stephen A. Douglas in a historic battle for the Senate seat in Illinois. The series of debates between the two men became some of the most famous political oratory of the time. Both Lincoln and Douglas were skilled debaters and accomplished speakers, but they couldn't have been more different in style. Douglas, short and round, used his commanding voice and smooth gestures to sway crowds. Lincoln, tall and gaunt, had an awkward presence and a piercing, almost shrill voice. But Lincoln's speeches, with their eloquence, brevity, and powerful messages, stood in sharp contrast to the verbose speeches common at the time. These debates were published in 1860 in a best-selling book, which Lincoln himself compiled and marketed as part of his campaign. While Lincoln and Douglas disagreed fiercely in public, their views were not as far apart as they seemed. Neither was an abolitionist or pro-slavery, but Lincoln took a firm stand on one crucial issue. Congress must actively prevent slavery from spreading into new territories. Douglas, however, believed that the territories were unsuitable for slavery on their own and didn't need any legislative action to keep slavery out. Lincoln, in one of his most famous speeches, declared, "A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe the government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free." He believed the country would eventually have to choose between being entirely free or entirely slave. Lincoln made it clear that the future of the country depended on protecting the civil liberties of all U.S. citizens, both black and white. He argued that the territories should remain free because they offered new free states where poor people could improve their lives. However, Lincoln agreed with Thomas Jefferson and other founding fathers that slavery should be contained, not directly attacked. Politically, Lincoln also reassured his audiences that he did not support black citizenship or equality. In fact, he famously told a crowd in Charleston, Illinois, "I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races." He went on to say that the physical difference between black and white people would prevent them from living together as equals in society. Throughout the debates, Lincoln skillfully exposed the inconsistency in Douglas's position. Douglas championed popular sovereignty, the idea that settlers in the territories should decide whether to allow slavery. But Lincoln pointed out how this principle contradicted the 1857 Dred Scott decision, in which the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that Congress couldn't ban slavery from the territories. The debates were a pivotal moment in Lincoln's rise to national prominence and set the stage for the larger political battles to come. In the end, Abraham Lincoln lost the Senate race to Stephen A. Douglas, but the outcome didn't shock him. However, it deeply affected him. Despite the loss, Lincoln's performance in the debates had earned him national recognition, and soon he was being mentioned as a potential presidential candidate for 1860. His moment came on May 18, 1860, when, after careful preparation with his allies, Lincoln secured the Republican nomination on the third ballot at the party's national convention in Chicago. Lincoln then set aside his law practice and dedicated himself fully to his campaign. Although he didn't give traditional stump speeches, he focused on guiding the direction of his campaign. His main object, as he put it, was to hedge against divisions in the Republican ranks, and he advised party workers to avoid talking about issues where disagreements might arise. With the Republicans unified and the Democrats split among 4 candidates, Lincoln was able to secure the presidency. On November 6, 1860, he won the election, even though he received no votes from the Deep South and only about 40% of the national popular vote. However, due to the way the votes were distributed, Lincoln emerged with a clear and decisive majority in the Electoral College, securing his place in history. After Abraham Lincoln's election, but before his inauguration, South Carolina made a bold move by declaring its withdrawal from the Union. This set off a chain reaction, and other Southern states soon followed suit, with various proposals for compromise coming up in Congress to prevent further disunion. The most prominent of these was the Crittenden Compromise, which suggested constitutional amendments to protect slavery in states where it already existed and to divide the territories between slavery and freedom. While Lincoln didn't oppose the idea of protecting slavery where it already existed, he was firmly against any compromise that would expand slavery into new territories. He wrote privately that he was inflexible on this issue, fearing that dividing the territories would encourage pro-slavery forces to seek new lands for slavery, potentially creating a slave empire. From his home in Springfield, Lincoln urged Republican members of Congress to reject the territorial division proposal, and the plan was ultimately defeated in committee. But despite these efforts, 6 additional Southern states seceded and formed the Confederate States of America, leaving the country on the brink of a civil war before Lincoln had even taken office. The nation's attention quickly shifted to Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. The fort was still under construction and manned by U.S. troops, led by Major Robert Anderson. The Confederacy claimed the fort and began threatening it from other nearby fortifications. Anticipating trouble, Lincoln, still in Springfield, secretly asked General Winfield Scott, the U.S. Army's general-in-chief, to prepare to either hold or retake the fort if necessary, once Lincoln was inaugurated. In his inaugural address on March 4, 1861, Lincoln emphasized the Union's indestructibility and called for sectional harmony. At the same time, he reaffirmed his stance on Fort Sumter, saying that he would take measures to maintain the federal presence there. Lincoln's words would set the stage for the unfolding conflict, as tensions between the North and South reached their boiling point.